we're, of course, live now with Dacre Stoker, a friend of the channels. I guess, as the kids always say, a friend of yours and mine. So, Dacre, thank you once again for jumping aboard here and sharing some exceptionally exciting news that goes well beyond Dracula and Bram Stoker. So, much appreciate you having me here.
Well, thanks, Rick. It's been great chatting with you, over the last year or so, mostly about literary projects, right? Graphic novels and stuff like that. Now we're actually moving into trying to raise money for a documentary film and telling you and your listeners all the cool stuff that goes into this. It's the first one that I've actually done this at this level. I've been involved in as a consultant and as a talking head on different documentaries, but not one where it's actually I'm involved from the ground up. So, we got lots of cool stuff to talk about. If we can tell your people, how this thing works, how it gets thrown together like this, and hopefully we'll have an ace product.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the most exciting things so far in chatting with you about Bram Stoker and Dracula is talking about the origin and a lot of the unknown facts. So it's super exciting to be able to talk to you about this. And I suppose the best way to start is perhaps by the origin. So to ask a simple question that likely doesn't come with a simple answer, what was the first time that you finally decided that, yes, you actually want to do some sort of a film project? And how did you come about to pick the filmmaker Jason Figgis, as well as the writer for the screenplay, John West?
Well, I guess it comes from watching other documentaries, some about other authors and a few about Bram Stoker. And quite frankly, the ones about Bram Stoker have been very dated and not very accurate, as have been some of the biographies written. So I felt, about 5 years ago, it was time to do something about it. And there's a couple of pitches that I managed to put out to different studios and, the timing wasn't right or we couldn't raise the money, one reason after another. And I happened to be in Dublin, actually just outside of Dublin, Ireland, Dunlowry at a film festival where I was hosting and talking about Bram and so on, where I met Jason Figgis, who's a native of Dublin. And he already had a pretty good pedigree of making interesting films himself, documentaries and feature films, low budget things, which are kind of more my area of interest. And he said, Dacre, I think you'd really like to see this film I'm doing on Sir Simon Marsden, who is a famous photographer. And what caught my attention was the vibe that Jason captured. This sort of Victorian Gothic style of film where this photographer, he was not, claiming to capture ghosts, but he was capturing the feeling and that sort of aura that goes along with the, potential supernatural and the paranormal, whatever you want to call it. And it was just wonderful, sensitive, informative, entertaining. And I said, that's the guy I'd like to work with someday. Plus the fact that he's a Dubliner and he knows the city and he knows historically the city that Bram was raised in. So that was the start. And then he introduced me a couple of years later to John West, who has written some on ghosts in England. He's a great guy. And most importantly, he was really interested in hearing what I had to say about Bram. So I sent him a lot of research and he together a first draft of a script. I did to work on it with him, and we finally got it all worked out. And then the narration started, and it's sort of funny to you've got the right guys, but we've realized the three of us we're just going to have to do it ourselves. We had a couple overtures a couple of years ago where somebody wanted to give us a bunch of money and put it on a big network, and it just never happened. And these things happen so often. We didn't get too excited about it because it's like, until you sign that contract. But nevertheless, on this case, we said, we're doing it ourselves. And hopefully we'll make money on the back end. But until then, we're just going to do it along and along and along. So, the script was done. The narration was done. I literally sat in my home in South Carolina and I bought a nice microphone and did the narration, bits and pieces, sort of 4 or 5 minutes at a time over about 4 or 5 days. And now we're waiting. Jason's got imagery. We've got video you and I could talk about. but we're waiting to put it all together when we raise the money from the Indiegogo campaign, which will start at the beginning of April, to do all the editing. That's the expensive part. We can't just do in-house. Jason's got to go to a fancy studio for a week or so and just get down to work with all the bells and whistles that they go with editing good things, putting in music and background effects and so on.
Cool. And you are a master of the tease, Dacre. I definitely want to talk to you a little bit about some of the video that you've seen so far. But before I do, though, anybody that knows anything about you knows that you have spent much of your life researching, gathering information about your great-granduncle, Bram Stoker, and of course his life work, in particular Dracula. So how do you take the culmination of everything we've picked up along the way, every little piece of that puzzle, putting it all together, and then being able to bring that down to, and I believe it's you're going for it. It's a 90-minute movie?
Yeah, that's the goal. A 90-minute documentary film, yeah.
Gotcha. So how do you get almost a lifetime of work and just kind of get that up into a little 90-minute ball of information regarding...
Yeah, of excitement and horror. Well, first of all, as the writer and researcher, you put a lot of things out there onto the general outline, much like I would when I read a novel. And then, of course, you've got two other guys in the process between John and Jason who will say, okay, let's stay focused on who's the audience. Are they people that really know Dracula? Or are they people that would like to know more about Dracula? And we sort of boil it down to, this is for general consumption, not experts, because experts already know an awful lot. So you've got to know your audience. And therefore, certain amount of information may be irrelevant or over their head, and you don't want to dummy it down too much. So you want to hit that middle road of, who was Bram Stoker? What was his life like? What things in his own life ended up worked their way into the fabric of Dracula, either by inspiration or recounting real things. So when I thought something might be really interesting to me, and I'd bounce it off John, he goes, be honest, Dacre, I don't think that's that's great, or it's not too good, or a little too complicated, or some effect. And I have to trust his instinct that he's a good sounding board. Or, hey, let me take that to Jason, and he may come back and say, hey, that's great, elaborate on that. So I have to trust in the process that these guys are going to give me honest appraisal of what I'm suggesting is included in the story. So we have these sort of conversations, these Zoom conversations, where Jason may say, hey, guys, we got to do something about the Bram Stoker and Trinity. He's a Dubliner, and he wrote it. He did running races, and he did this. Something, oh, okay, I'll go back to my research, and we'll pull out something really interesting there. I think, Jason, he must have recovered from his childhood illness by doing these long-distance race walking and all these other sports. So that, leads to something else. So here I am with a lot of, as you said, it's 15 years of research. It all can't fit in. You've got to pick and choose sort of a logical continuum of the story. And obviously what people like is his life and what went in Dracula. Now, we do touch on some of his other stories, but, those are not quite as popular as Dracula. So I don't spend a lot of time on that.
So it's fair to say that, and so just to clarify for me and everybody watching this right now then, so it does focus primarily on his most popular work, of course, which, as I mentioned, is Dracula, as well as Bram's early life, and I'm assuming perhaps some of the circumstances around his death and beyond that a little bit?
Well, yeah, I guess to sort of create this timeline is what you do is his early life, mysterious illness, how he recovered, and what was going on in his life during that 7 years, sort of what I call markers. And there is markers during that time. And one of them is one of the stories that his mother told him. And it was a true factual story of her actually experiencing the 1832 cholera epidemic. And she wrote an account of it. She was only 14, but some years later, she wrote this account as a 14-year-old girl, what she saw, what was going on. And Rick, you know what she saw? I mean, it's unbelievable for a young girl to, first of all, knowing that their next-door neighbor, the mother and father, had been taken away in the cholera cart, and the little daughter, who was 2 years old, Mary Sheridan, was left in the house screaming, crying, no food, no milk, whatever. And Charlotte Stoker, she wasn't Stoker at the time, she was Thornley, last name Thornley, wanted to go and help the baby, but the mother didn't want her to potentially catch the cholera because nobody knew how it was transmitted. Right. They thought it was airborne and you could just get close to somebody and get breathe the stuff that's in. So they wouldn't let her go, but she went anyway to comfort this child, and picked up little Mary Sheridan and brought her back to her house. She just could not show the compassion for this child whose parents are gone and she could just die of starvation on the floor, and brought back to the Thornleys' home and totally fumigated both of them. And neither of them died, obviously, otherwise I wouldn't be here. I don't know how long Mary Sheridan lived, but she didn't die from this case. So that was how close she came to dying, and therefore there would have been no Bram, no Dacre, nobody else in the Stoker family in this branch. But she also witnessed people being misdiagnosed of death, being buried prematurely, and crawling out of their graves when identified and getting out of all the dead bodies. So I can only imagine when I then connect that and I speak to psychologists who understand about Victorian era and traumas of childhood and so on, they say, that had to have affected young Bram, sickly kid himself. Maybe he was thinking he'd be misdiagnosed and buried prematurely. I don't know if that's why I have claustrophobia, if that's something that was in the blood, but I noticed it when I went into an MRI for a shoulder problem, and I couldn't handle it. So I freaked out and had to get out. So, those are the things to look at. It's interesting markers throughout the life where these things that he was told or that he did, like a clerk in the Petty Sessions legal department and traveled around the country in a carriage, in a train, to go visit the other 30 counties in the country to make sure all the clerks were doing all the right legal stuff. And that should ring a bell to you, Rick, because you know Dracula in the back of your hand. That's Jonathan Harker, isn't it?
Exactly, 100%.
So that's Bram inserting himself this way. And then later on, he gets the dream job of his life. After Trinity College, he goes to work the Lyceum Theatre in London for Henry Irving, who, amongst many other roles, plays Mephistopheles, the devil, in the play Faust. And we all know that in the books Bram was looking at in the London Library, he found the devil, meaning Dracula, in Wallachia, which is right next door to Transylvania. So all little things may seem like pieces of a puzzle, but they all came together for Bram, and it might have been well orchestrated, but the way that Jason, John, and I are doing this, it is sort of like a piece of the puzzle that comes together, and this extra piece comes in. Then another one comes in, and it begins to take shape. So from the story idea to a visual, transferring that to visual, that's kind of the way we were thinking about it, and the way that it will be edited to be so.
Very cool. And since you told me about this as well, Dacre, about this documentary, is I kind of wonder, because I know there's been a lot of pieces that you put together, some pieces that have been missing for a long time, or some pieces that were missing that people didn't even realize were missing, such as, of course, the original manuscript for Dracula, which I have, I can see over your shoulder, actually, as well, the annotated version.
I see it over your shoulder, too. It's just behind your head, yeah.
Well, so it's over there, too, so it's incredible because you put 30,000 words that weren't in the original manuscript, along with an original ending for Dracula that a lot of folks, such as me included, weren't even aware existed until just recently. So when you're focusing on Bram Stoker and his work in this film project, which ending did you go with? And I understand there might even be a third alternative ending as well.
So that's the tough one, because there is so much information, and some of it is really cool information about the writing of the novel Dracula and these discoveries. So let's first explain to your listeners what you and I are talking about, so you put it in context. Because, spoiler alert, it's not all of it is going into the documentary. We could practically do a 45-minute segment just on what I'm about to explain. But so Bram Stoker wrote the novel over 7 years. One copy of the manuscript that has been typed, and it was typed by a typing service, because I'm one of 6 people that have actually seen what's called the type script as opposed to a manuscript, because it's typed. And I've seen the stamp on it, and I researched the stamp and found that it was a typing service in Hampstead, part of London. So he takes it to a typing service, they type it all up. But then, and all the authors in the audience will be thinking, oh, geez, nowadays we just have multiple copies on our computer, and you send it off to your publisher, and they start doing the strike through, the daunting edits and so on, suggestion notes. Well, even back in the day at Archibald Constable Publishing Company, Bram's editor took his pencil to it, or his pen to it. And as we found out, his brother, Bram's older brother Thornley, took his blue pencil to it, because he was functioning as the medical advisor to the story, to make sure that the degree of accuracy that Bram wanted in the story was adhered to for everything medical. Now, that's the blood transfusions. That's the brain trepanation surgery on Renfield. That's any of the types of knives, tools that were used to cut Lucy's head off, all that cool stuff. and so his brother had to go with that too, to say, for instance, during the transfusion, both people would be lying down at this stage, as opposed to one sitting up and one lying down. So little things. But, Rick, as you have now read, the first 3 chapters of the novel were taken out. And the only hint, up until I've been able to analyze the typescript, was that Florence Stoker, 2 years after Bram died, he died in 1912, in 1914, she published, by the Rutledge and Company, a series of short stories, and one of them was called Dracula's Guest. Dracula's Guest, the preface for that, she said, this was excised out of my husband's most famous work due to its length. I'm sure his fans will love this. So scholars looked at this and go, wait a sec. And we don't have no proof that this was part of Dracula. They're just trying to say that to sell more copies. So I found in TypeScript 4 specific references to things that happened in the short story Dracula's Guest in the remaining 480 some odd pages that were crossed out, and we could still read it. Crossed out with a pencil, but it was typed so you could read it. It wasn't like scratched out so bad. Right. So there was, that is proof alone that Dracula's Guest was part of this story up until quite late in the whole process of having the thing published. Was it part of it that was typed, or was it still in the handwritten stage and then it was taken out? We don't really know. But I will tell you what the other 2 chapters were, because in a similar fashion, once we analyzed the Dracula notes, you will see that Bram intended for chapter 1 to be a series of letters back and forth between many of the characters in the book, the lawyers, different characters, setting the stage as Bram would have done as the theater manager of the Lyceum Theater. A lot of details have to be worked out with different purveyors and actors and so on. He was doing the same with Dracula, so that we would know how did Count Dracula get a hold of a lawyer in Exeter? And what did he really want? How did he start thinking about buying the Carfax Abbey and another house and so on? So all that was laid out in the letters. So that was going to be chapter 1. Chapter 2, Dracula's Guest, because it dovetails perfectly with chapter 3 that has similar references that are cut out of the typescript. And that is the Jonathan Harker character who manages to survive a vampiric experience. Semi-spoiler alert. You guys should read Dracula's Guest, by the way. He goes into the Munich Dead House, which is the mortuary in Munich, which Irving and Stoker did on one of their trips there. And then also he went to the Munich Opera House. And the Munich Opera House was actually playing the opera Vanderkerken, which was the story of the mysterious ship that is a doomed ship, a ghost ship that can never land, which I'm sure, Rick, you're nodding your head thinking that's foreshadowing of the Demeter. Yep. So those were taken out. So are we using that much in the novel? In the documentary? Not so much, but we are talking about the deleted ending. So to give my voice a rest, Rick, why don't you start off by telling your audience, your listeners, what you remember from that book about what's so strange and different about this ending. And I'll jump in if I need to supplement it. But you're knowledgeable enough to know what was the original ending of Dracula planned to be. How did it differ from what most people who watch movies see this day?
Sure. Well, the tables have turned. I know you warned me that there would be homework, but so if I remember this correctly, and I know I'm not going to probably remember this quite as eloquently or perhaps as detailed as you, there's so much that was different about the ending for the original one, to the point where it almost seemed kind of rushed, because I guess in a sense it was, because Bram all of a sudden found himself having to essentially summarize the ending and take so much out of it. And the thing that I remember being most blown away by the ending is that, of course, as we all know what in the original novel, or the original published novel, I should say, is that the fact that Dracula, he dies. He dies by the Bowie knife. After the heroes catch up.
I'm going to help you here.
Sure.
The Bowie knife, Rick, is that the way in the novel Bram Stoker described anywhere in the novel you kill a vampire with a Bowie knife as opposed to, Eddie?
A snake.
Wooden stake. So if Bowie knife was used, did Bram Stoker really intend to kill the Count at the end of the novel? Or was it one of these elusive, ambiguous things?
It kind of feels like he was being a little bit cheeky, because it's almost like saying, fine, I'll change the ending to what you want, but I'm going to know the Dracula didn't really, that he didn't really succumb to those injuries at the end of it. That's because we'd find out later on, thanks to a lot of your research as well, that it's not quite the ending that Bram originally wrote. So
I'll let you off the hook and let you ready to say that word. It starts with a V. What was Bram planning that was crossed out?
It was the volcano, because
it was a volcanic eruption. Absolutely. And so one page of this typescript was literally crossed out, and it happened, as Rick just said, right after the knife was stabbed in the chest by Morris. The throat was slit as opposed to completely cut off, and there was no garlic to insert like they did for Lucy. Mm-hmm. And then they felt the ground begin to rumble and shift. This is the deleted part, guys. That's why this is news to you. The ground shifts, and a massive eruption happens. They happen to be on an extinct volcano. Bram was so detail-oriented that in his notes that live in Philadelphia, he actually wrote lines of longitude and latitude and mentioned names of rivers and a small town, and mentioned in the book where the good guys were chasing the gypsies who were pulling the Count on his leisure wagon in the crate, they would cross at the 47th parallel. And this was just at the base of Mount Israel, which is, to this day, a place where I've now been and put a plaque saying this is the location of Bram Stoker's fictional castle. It was an extinct volcano. So Bram did his homework. If he was going to have the story end on a volcano with a volcanic eruption, it was darn well going to be in a volcano. So, Rick, what do you remember? And again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but just want the listeners to hear. What do you remember about what was the significance of volcanoes back in those days to the type of character Bram researched to turn into his Count Dracula? Any little hits there about who lived in volcanoes?
I believe.
Where did the volcano lead to? The volcano led to where?
To hell.
To hell. Who lives in hell? The devil. So the books that I had researched in the London Library, two of them, one in Whitby Library and two of them in London Library, said that Dracula in Wallachian language means devil. Now, Wallachia is the province right next to Transylvania. It just happened that Wallachia doesn't have the mountain ranges that Transylvania does. Transylvania, being a little bit more northern than Wallachia, also has wonderful superstitions that Bram Stoker learned about, all by Emily Gerard, a Scottish lady who lived in Transylvania and researched all about folklore of Nosferatu, Strigoi, and vampire. So Bram took this info and said, okay, I got to change the deck just a little bit. I got to move Prince Vlad Dracula from Wallachia and move him into Transylvania. I got to put the castle that looks a lot like Bran Castle also in Wallachia. I got to move it up on top of this volcanic mountain up in Transylvanian mountains in the Kalpani National Park because it suits my story and it fits there. So all the stuff that Rick and I have just been telling you guys, does this work its way into the documentary? Absolutely. Maybe not in quite as long-winded a manner, but that's the whole idea is Bram was writing a novel that seemed real, and he needed to turn it from a supernatural, folkloric type story into something that people in London might seem is real. And they really did think that the devil was a creature that lived in the center of the earth, and the portals to hell were volcanoes. They also had sulfurous gases. And sulfur, as we know, the gases will kill things. They've had sulfuric gas that kills birds and so on. It smells like horrible rotten eggs. It smells like hell. So these are things, and as I said, I've been there with my son. I lead tours over there. They have these hot springs, and they smell like, sulfur, kind of gross, but oh boy, they're nice to sit in and get nice and warm and soothe the muscles and everything else. But back in the day, there was lots of references to the ground shifting, the smelling of this horrible death-like gases. All of it had to be edited out, just like Dracula's Guest, because Bram or his publisher decided that we don't want a definitive ending to this villain. We've got to have him make some sort of an escape. And that's why, Rick, I believe that the Count crumbles to dust after the Bowie knife goes in. His throat is partially slit. He makes an escape. He makes sort of a mockery of what these band of heroes have put a lot of effort into to chase him back. They're just about to get him before he retreats back into his castle as the nightfall happens, powers and everything into his castle, but they stop him before that, but he still gets away. And destruction of the castle is eliminated. And now it's just, back to normal. The band of heroes look around and say, well, here we are. What do we do? And they go back to England and sort of lick their wounds and try to get back to normal, because they say no one will believe us. Our story will stay with ourselves. We don't need to tell anybody else. Rick, they go back 7 years later. And they go back to pay homage to the one guy that died, the American, Quincy Morris. Well, he was the one that did the thrusting of the knife. And they left his body there. They buried it somewhere there. And so they do actually go back, almost like they're fighting with fire. And luckily, there's no Count Dracula that pays any attention to them. They don't see him, but they just sort of end the story as, we paid our homage to our wonderful Quincy. And they bring this little baby with them, Jonathan and Nita's baby, which, of course, begs the question. He's now a little child born at the end of Dracula. Whose child is he? And what the heck is he doing over there?
Wow. Now, that's something I hadn't really thought about as far as the child goes. That's super interesting. Regarding a lot of the manuscripts, I know you mentioned that you're one of 6 people that have actually seen this hand-typed manuscript. Are you going to be adding to the list of people that have seen this by somehow weaving that into the film project, or perhaps other manuscripts that you've come across? Or are we going to get a chance to see that on screen?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer, because it's all about sort of privacy that the owners of these things allow. For instance, the 2 most important documents that are out there pertaining to Bram Stoker's work of Dracula is his notes, 125 pages of notes that live in the Rosenbach Museum in Philadelphia. They've allowed their notes to be published. Elizabeth Miller, who's no longer living, and Robert 18 Bassang, who's no longer living, published these a few years ago by McFarland, and they're out there. I mean, I know the hardcover, I think, is out of print, but the paperback is still in print. Bram Stoker's Tales for Dracula. They are a great resource. Now, the Dracula typescript was purchased by Paul Allen for just under $1 million. He was a co-founder of Microsoft and many other things. He's no longer living, and the people that run his estate don't allow many people to see it. And if you see it, you have to sign an NDA that you won't show any pictures. And I've asked them very nicely on 2 occasions, would you consider having any of this stuff published for the good of Dracula studies? And they keep giving me a polite no. Robert Bassang, who I wrote this book with, he was one of the guys that did get to see it, and he remembered an awful lot of things. We weren't allowed to keep notes or take pictures, but he remembered certain things that were taken out at the typescript stage. We also have been able to include in this book things that we knew that were taken out, because we both were able to buy a catalog of the auction when the typescript was auctioned off by Christie's. So they actually had a picture of the deleted ending, and I'm able to show that picture at different places because I paid a royalty to Bookman, who had a deal with Christie's. So even though the Paul Allen estate doesn't allow it out there, some of the things that we had remembered are included in this book here that shows, for instance, that the pieces that show that Dracula guest was edited out of the chapter 2, and other places where it was taken out, we made a footnote of it. But I just wish they would allow the whole thing to be published, much like Rosenbach did, because it's not like they need the money.
We're holding on to it for it. It's not getting more value. It's just not being shared.
And you know, it's a shame because it's such an interesting piece of Dracula history, my family's history. Yes, granted, it was sold by Florence 2 years after Bram died, so you know it's gone. I mean, I wish she'd kept hold of it, but it's now it's out there, and it's like other amazing artifacts at the whim of people who paid good money for it. So I don't begrudge them for it, but it would be it would be nice if they do allow a few pages to be reproduced and shown at the Museum of Popular Culture in Seattle. So it's not completely shut down, but occasionally 4 or 5 pages get put out there, reproduced and put out there. But to me, I just think it'd be really cool if the whole thing could be annotated properly and put out for the world to see.
Yeah, no, 100%. And speaking of which, too, one of the other things that I really wanted to ask you about as well, Dacre, is that I understand that very recently, at least, you would discover that there was some sort of a Icelandic or Swedish translation of Dracula that you found, ended up having, I guess, a much different preface to Dracula than the one that we always knew it to be, at least for the last, 127, 128 years going on here. Could you talk a little bit about that? It just blows my mind that we're still finding this kind of unknown facts about Dracula.
Well, it is cool. A fellow by the name of Hans de Roos, who is a guy I know very well. We've traveled a lot in Transylvania together doing research and so on. He's one of these guys that doesn't take no for an answer. And he heard of, in 1989, a fellow was able to, he discovered, he was a book collector, that there was a preface to the Icelandic edition of Dracula published in 1901. That was very different than the preface that was discovered, that we all know about, which was about a paragraph long in Dracula. Basically says, the events here really took place and the names have been changed to protect the innocent, that type of thing. Well, this one went on to really go into much more detail about things that really happened in this. It's about a page and a half of very interesting sort of testimony, really, that all these people are real people and these things really happened, and the murders of Jack the Ripper, come into the story later and so on. So strangely, he didn't have an easy way to translate the rest of the story back in 1989. So he stopped there. He just felt it was lots of different words because it was a difficult language like Icelandic. But he did get the preface translated. And then Hans de Roos found that it was also translated in Sweden in a very similar way. So to cut to the chase here, what happened was novels in those days, to get them published in a country, had to have them serialized in a newspaper before they could be published. So you're essentially, a foreign author would need to, publisher would need to say, before I can publish it, Mr. Stoker, we've got to get it into the newspaper. So 1 chapter a day for 27 days, so on. And then once that happens, we can publish it. Well, in Sweden, it turns out, and de Roos gets credit for this, along with another guy called Richard Berkhorn, who looked into this independently of de Roos. They both came up with a similar conclusion. And I was consulted on all this stuff because the stories in one newspaper was abridged and one it was much longer. And then somehow the stories in the newspapers went to Iceland, where the same thing happened in a newspaper, and then it could be published. But it wasn't published in a book form in Sweden for a long time. So the story was much longer, much more violent, much more sexual, and involved sort of fascism. It involved sort of the rise of fascism, which once de Roos and Berkhorn were bouncing these things around and off other scholars, so we collectively kind of thought, that makes sense. If it's going to be in a newspaper, then a newspaper writer or an editor is going to add some spice to it. And in the early 1900s, what's going on in Germany, a very powerful country in Europe, is beginning to rise fascism. And this is the whole idea that they're trying to scare the hell out of people, that Count Dracula is sort of like a politically driven creature that's coming to London, not so much to drink blood, but to corrupt other politicians. So they're almost like inserting Hitler into this thing as a supernatural vampire.
Right, reach as like a piece of propaganda rather than just a dark tale, like a dark gothic tale of a bloodsucking
Yes, yes, Rick, absolutely, and it would sell. It would sell because that would strike a nerve with these folks. So this is sort of what I really think is sort of was the result of this. And fun enough, in Sweden, the newspaper articles, they actually hired an artist to have drawings each day that depicted scenes in the story. And my buddy Hans de Roos has done this once, and now he's doing it again in a more deluxe edition. But being a photographer and a graphic artist, he's been able to take those images and really clean them up nicely and color them. And he's got a Kickstarter going on right now. I actually wrote the introduction to this book on Kickstarter. And it's essentially the first graphic novel of Dracula back from, early 1900s. And it is those images in those newspapers that was similar to Dracula, but as I said, more sexual, more violent, and Dracula didn't die at the end. He came to London, for political reasons. So that's one of those mysteries that it's like, where did that come from? But luckily, again, there's guys like Burkhorn and de Roos that share the information, and those of us in the scholarly community kind of came to the conclusion that, look, based on Bram Stoker's Dracula, but it was someone else that actually had handiwork in lengthening the story and adding more spice to it.
Yeah, now I wonder what Bram thought of all that as well while that was happening. Like, was he couldn't aware?
We don't. I've never seen anything. The family didn't know about it. It's not like we found a ton of his journals either. I found one journal of his, but it was something written well before he started writing Dracula. So it wasn't like, oh my God, I'm really upset. They screwed up my book in Iceland and Sweden.
Right.
No mention of it. So we don't know if he ever even knew about it. And, I know he didn't speak. I know he spoke French, some French. Don't think he spoke any Swedish or Icelandic. So Rick, he may never have known about it.
Yeah, and from what I understand too, I don't think he's done a whole lot of interviews. I think, was it Winston Churchill, wasn't it, that he did the lengthiest interview regarding Dracula after he published it?
Well, it was actually, he did do an interview with he interviewed himself, Winston Churchill, but he was interviewed by a lady called Jane Stoddard,
okay,
the British Weekly. And it was a few months after Dracula came out. And, it was pretty in-depth. And we will go into detail about that, because that's one of those things that the only interview, and it asks him, where did you find information about the vampire myth? What's it all about? To tell us about Van Helsing, a very interesting, Dutch lawyer, doctor, expert in the supernatural, that kind of thing. So it's quite telling, and we will be touching upon that in the documentary.
Very cool. And when you were touching on these sort of awesome points, Dacre, in the documentary, I know you mentioned that you do much of the narration yourself in the documentary, but is there also, I'm picturing sort of almost like a stop motion sort of sense of images going on in the background, or if it's maybe filmography that you've done or other people have done while touring all the wonderful settings, maybe Curtin Bay where the novel's written, maybe Transylvania where it's set in. How is that going to be actually translated into a conversation about it to, a film?
Well, that's the magic of Jason Figgis. That's where a director and editor, he's doing both, will take the script that West and I have done and my narration has covered. He'll see these things. Okay, we're talking about Whitby. Well, luckily, Colin Hamilton, who is an Irish guy, good friend of mine, used to be a Sky TV videographer in the first Persian Gulf War, and embedded in other wars in Europe before he said enough of this, and he married a nice Romanian lawyer, and I visit him every time I'm in Romania. He's actually visited me in South Carolina, and we've got a lot of footage because we just felt that one day we're going to need this footage for something. So whenever we're in a cool castle, or he may come when I'm at a convention somewhere or at an event where there's other interesting people to interview, I may interview them. Colin captures it on film. So we've got lots of footage that we then send to Jason. I even alerted Jason that there was some very interesting people coming to a a Dracula convention that I couldn't get to. Hans de Roos is one of them. William Hughes is another. Senator David Norris, who's a member, a cousin of the Stokers, is another. And he went and interviewed them. So independently, over about 3 to 4 years, just collected all these different videos and what they call B-roll, background roll. I mean, really good stuff. Drone footage that Colin has over Bran Castle, over Mount Israel, the volcano in the Carpathian Mountains, Cruden Bay, Scotland, where Bram wrote the novel, showing Slane's castle from above and from inside. Really good stuff with high-level, high-res cameras that then Jason looks at and says, how can I work with this? And then he will use some of that going on in the background when I'm narrating or any of these other, interesting, as we call them, talking heads that get inserted to bring up other points that, you don't want to hear one guy's voice the whole time when you're doing a documentary. You've got to intersperse it with good stuff, as well as still photos. Nowadays, you put a still photo in, you have some effects with it. It may move, it may tilt, comes to life that way. But Jason's so good at that, that he'll have his work cut out for him. But, again, first of all, we got to raise the 30 grand on Indiegogo to rent the space in these, high level studios to do all this type of editing, add music, add effects, and all this stuff to everything we've collected over the last couple of years.
That's incredible to hear that, and definitely I can't wait to talk to him about this as well, to see exactly how he kind of welded his magic to mold all this information into a film. And I love the fact too, you touched on it too, regarding talking to other people that have been influenced by Bram Stoker's work, those that have sort of touched upon his life in one way or another, because I've always more appreciated that. I mean, it's great to see, one of those silly reenactments biographies, and it's interesting, it's lazy, you don't have to use your imagination, but I much prefer talking to those real people that actually have real influence, and that were in fact, really there at the time, perhaps, or at least as close to the time as we can get. Yeah. Regarding that, you mentioned a little while ago as well that regarding his mom, of course, being an absolute, like a lot of us boys, a major influence on Bram Stoker's life, and certainly his work in some extremely profound ways. So is the film also going to be centered around, a lot more of that influence with his mom, as well as his wife Florence as well?
Well, that's a big part. I mean, when you recognize how much of a feminist Bram Stoker was, I mean, he was. Why do I say that? Because not only was Mina Murray, who married Jonathan Harker and became Mina Harker during the novel, what they call the new woman, she was pretty much Bram Stoker's mother and sister, all sort of combined. The activist that she was, and also the glue that held together the band of heroes, much like Charlotte Stoker was the glue that held together 7 kids and a husband. She was this major force. She read papers in front of the all-male social and inquiry society of Dublin, which means you march in and you give your opinion on a paper that you have gotten permission to read about. In her case, she read 3 papers. One was about the education of the deaf and the mute, another about how you prove if somebody is criminally insane, and the other is about the plight of women in workhouses. So all these kind of interesting social issues. And when I say that, Rick, remember 3 brothers in the Stoker family, my great-grandfather being one of them, were doctors. So the whole issue, not just of Mina being a strong woman and being an advanced woman, knowing how to typewrite, and her opinion being listened to by this Dutch Germanic Van Helsing, that also the whole story was touching heavily upon the plight of Renfield. the man with mental health problems. Back in those days, this was a big issue, and some people just sort of wanted to ignore it. And these people with mental health issues were just thrown in jail. Whereas the Asylum Act in the late 1800s, early 1900s in London started to establish these asylums for mental patients, and people were being sent there where they were hopefully going to be treated. Now, the treatment that we now read about was obviously cutting edge at the time, but it was nothing compared to how it evolved. Yeah. But Renfield represents that effort. And as I have dug in deeper and deeper into Sir William Thornley's life, Dr. Stoker, the older brother who helped Bram with all the medical stuff, he was also a professor teaching about brain surgery and so on. So he was in a tough position because he recognized the need to do these surgical explorations where medical students could see the head of monkeys and dogs have their skull cut off, lifted off while they're alive, and poking and prodding going on to the brain to see what kind of motor parts would control what parts of the body. However, this was looked at as being sometimes abused by too many professors doing this, sort of for ratings more than for the need to educate. And so a board was set up to apply for a license to prove you needed to do the surgery. And Bram Stoker, his brother, Thornley, became an inspector of this vivisection to grant the license or not, only if the doctor had proved to Thornley, one of his peers, that we need to do this. Otherwise, it ends up in pain and suffering for the animal. Not all these animals, were all euthanized at the end of the experiment. They were left alive, in a part of the lab for weeks where they would get infection and die horrible deaths. So, long story short, I challenge every one of you listeners to look back at Dracula, either online, and let me just tell them, I'm not just trying to sell you books. You can go to bramstoker.org, which is a website run by a professor, free, totally free. Don't even have to sign up. Just go to bramstoker.org, and you'll find all of Bram Stoker's public domain books, which are all of them except for the Lost Journal that Miller and I published a few years ago. You can read Dracula for free and Dracula's Guest, but look at it and do a word search for evil scientist. Evil scientist. Dracula was being portrayed not just as a blood-sucking vampire supernatural creature coming to drink blood, but between Seward and Van Helsing, they had realized that Dracula was doing experiments on Van Helsing by forcing him and coercing him to eat these different insects to sort of extend life, different types of bugs, different creatures as you go higher up the scale. And Van Helsing, Seward even said at one point, "Oh, I'd love to do surgery on him to find out more, if only it was necessary."
I love that one.
And that's just a little line, Rick, that Bram got from his brother. So when you know these little backstories, and I've just rambled for about 5 minutes on it, all good for about 2 or 3 lines in the story, you know now why Renfield was in the story and why Thornley Stoker, did what he did. It all sort of makes sense. And I'll kind of end this part of it by saying, if you really look at this, Dracula is really a murder mystery thriller with a supernatural twist, more than a supernatural story where somebody dies. Lucy has to die, get killed. Lucy's mother dies. There's some other people that die mysteriously throughout the story. And it's like, well, and the band of heroes are running around trying to find clues as to where is Count Dracula live. We've got to get his address. We've got to get permission to get into this house. All this information as they're tracking him down, and they turn around And obviously there's vampiric things going on, and there's mesmerism going on, all this other stuff. But it's it's an advanced supernatural murder mystery, mystery thriller.
Yeah, and there's so many complexities to this as well. But I one of the things that I really enjoyed about Dracula in particular as well is that despite all of the complexities, it's incredibly relatable as well when you're really kind of take a step back, you peel back all the different characters that are involved in this to to tell their little each of their parts of the tale. And I think what's really interesting is that that's a lot of what the book was about too, is about relationships and how these such different people all came together and how they intermingled, some for better, some for good. Obviously, anybody that was, had any long-lasting dealings with Dracula typically didn't turn out too well for them. So you've got those relationships around, various relationships even with Dracula and the gypsies. My question regarding that is, I understand from some of your notes before, Dacre, that makes a lot of sense that Bram would also be such a study of characters as well. Probably why he loved being a theater manager, being a part of the theater, is it's the embodiment of all these different characters being brought to life and being interpreted by the people bringing them to life. And I understand that he also probably had a lot of inner reflection on his own relationships with himself and the people around him, because there are some questions about him exploring various aspects, I think, of Bram's own sexuality and his relationship with his wife that I would love to chat with you about, because I understand that, especially for the time, that wasn't something that you were, from what I understand, not as free to come out and talk about your sexuality. It didn't quite fit in with, the perceived norm at the time, as it thankfully is more so accepted now,
right?
As it should be. But that maybe Dracula was also, in many ways, Bram's exploration with his sexuality. Is there a lot of truth to that, do you think?
Well, it's really hard to say, and it's obviously a delicate subject. But back in the day, it was really hard to understand, male macho relationships and stuff that they did together, and then sensitive relationships they had together. I think Bram Stoker and Henry Irving had a very good understanding of each other, and had a real mutual symbiotic need for each other. And, as Bram says, as much as one man can love another. Now, that's been interpreted by some people as, they must have had a homosexual relationship, or maybe it was a bisexual relationship, as much as one man can love one another without breaking the law. Obviously, homosexuality was illegal at the time. Oscar Wilde got thrown in jail. Bram Stoker also wrote a letter to Walt Whitman. It sort of exposed himself as a young man idolizing the freedom that Walt Whitman had. Did Bram Stoker know that he was a homosexual? Did he admire the freedom that Walt Whitman could write about it in America and not write about it in books that he was trying to sell in England? And Bram tried to get Walt Whitman to use censorship so he could sell more books. And Whitman said, I'd just as soon never sell one more book if I have to censor my books and not use the freedom that I'm given to write what I want to write in it. And again, some people, a certain biographer has taken that as, Bram must have had a homosexual overtones or undertones, for Walt Whitman.
Sure.
So I can't tell you if having been there, there's nothing I hear about in the family, not that anybody's ashamed of it, but it just, to me, it might have just been sensationalism to try to sell some books. I really don't know. And nowadays, if I come out hard against it, it's like, I'm homophobic. But if I am for it, then it's like jumping in a bandwagon without proof. So I really, it's hard. I have commented on it. I don't see any proof that, was Bram bisexual, homosexual. I think he was open-minded about many things. He had a very loving relationship with his wife, and he was a good father to his son. So I don't think it goes any farther than that, Rick. And we do touch upon this in the documentary because, people do. It is something that people talk about, and it's written in biography. So it does need to be broached in biography. So, yeah, there we go. I think I kind of summed it up in those words.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I mean, certainly from what I heard, obviously you're not gonna sit here with us today and spill the beans on all the documentaries. So we gotta, you have to leave something for anticipation.
Yeah,
but no, the little bit that you told me was it tells. It sounds like everybody's just sort of reading into this a lot more than what they really should, or kind of maybe.
Yeah, it's easy to do that. Right. Nowadays it is. I do want to. I mean, I want to share with you something else though, and I'm going to read this to you because it is another interesting part of Bram that I got a heck of a lot more proof to than some of these issues that you mentioned. So I'm going to read this to you. It is a quote from the novel. I'm going to read you a quote, and I want you to kind of think about it, Rick, and then we'll digest. I don't know how much longer you want to keep going here, but I do want to get this in because it's a part of Bram Stoker that not many people know about, and that Jason and I and John wanted to utilize this as a special thing to talk about in Bram's life. And I haven't talked about it in many podcasts either, but here we go. Do you not think that there are things which you cannot understand, and yet which are that some people can see that others cannot? Can you not understand that there are things that some people can see that others cannot? Any idea what that's referring to?
It sounds a lot like he's talking about just faith and people's hope in their belief system.
I think it goes deeper. Do you not think that there are things that some people can see and others cannot? Have you heard the term second sight, Rick?
I know.
Heard that term? Yeah.
Well, that's I could see that being an interpretation of that as well. That somebody's just more sensitive to things that are around them, be it sounds, being extra sensors.
So that's one little piece of evidence. And here's an example for your listeners. There's something that I found in the story that didn't mean much until I started looking into some of his other books. He wrote a chapter while he was in Cruden Bay, Scotland. Now, I've been to twice. Called The Mystery of the Sea is the book, but the early chapter that he released was The Seer. And it is a lady come down from the Highlands of Scotland named Gormala, who had second sight, the power of second sight. She could see things that others could not. She could see the future. She could see beyond what normal people were seeing. She could see, in one case, that someone's child was going to die the next day. Sure enough, there was an accident at the ocean. The baby drowned. That very same baby that Gormala saw. Okay, so far that's fiction, right? Bear with me. So I found an article in the Dundee, Scotland newspaper written by a guy. It says he went to Dundee to meet Henry Irving and his manager, Bram Stoker, after they were performing in the theater. There was a wonderful gathering in a nice big house, and he found Bram Stoker sitting by a fireplace with a small group of people around, far more interesting than Henry Irving, who was talking about himself mostly. And there was Bram with a brandy in his hand and a cigar, and they were all engaged in a discussion about second sight. Because, you see, people in Scotland, at least in the Highlands, had this sort of propensity to be interested in this, and also to certain people to experience it. This ability to see out there the things. And Norval Scrimmonger, the writer, wrote this article in 1930 or 31, years after 1904, when this incident happened. So I had the pleasure of listening to this, and now it's time to share this with you. that Bram Stoker mentioned as the discussion was going on. He wasn't giving a lecture or anything, just talking, that he too witnessed, while he was visiting Scotland, 2 instances of second sight. One was family he was visiting where the mother was holding their young child, 2 or 3-year-old, and the 5-year-old came in and was crying. The mother said, "What's the matter?" "Oh," and I don't know the name, but the name of the baby in arms at the moment, "Little Mary won't play with me." "Why not? She's dead." What a funny thing for a young girl to say. "What do you mean?" "No, she's dead. She won't play." "No, she's quite healthy. She's fine." And in fact, Bram said there was no sickness. There was nothing. And yet the next day, Bram found out that the child woke up dead. So this young girl either was really lucky in her prediction or she possessed some kind of second sight. And then he went on to a second story that spanned over 2 years, where Slains Castle, the big castle in Cruden, incidentally, the castle, as I've told you, Rick, and you know about it because you've got a picture of a poster of you in your room there. That's the castle Bram used the interior layout of for his interior of his fictional castle, Dracula. The Earl of Errol lived in there, and he invited some of the more fancy people to go on a pheasant shoot, and Bram was invited. And as a shooter, you're given a loader, much like a fishing guide. You get a guy to come along, carry the shotguns for you, and help you on your way, and load the gun. You're booming, and he's loading and changing guns. And you develop a rapport with the guy over the course of the day. And Bram being played says, "Well, how's the Earl?" And this Highland guide says, "Oh, the sheet is high." And Bram goes, "What do you mean?" "The sheet, he's high. He's not well." So, Rick, the sheet being high is, the sheet that gets pulled over the head when the guy dies. It was being, it was high somewhere.
It's getting there.
It's getting there. Yes. And the shoot ends and the holiday ends for Bram. He's up there a couple of weeks. The Earl is fine, and Bram goes back to London. He comes back to Cruden Bay the next summer, as he did for 12 or 13 summers. And he's invited out again for another shoot. And he requests the same loader because he wants to question the guy. "Well, how are you again? Nice to see you, sir. How is the Earl?" "I see he's quite well. You made a mistake last year." He goes, "Oh, no, sir. The sheet is higher still." "Oh, it's too bad. Has he been ill?" "No, not at all. But it's higher." And apparently either 3 or 4 days later, the Earl, who'd been in excellent health, had an unexpected brain aneurysm and died. So one could say, yeah, all you got to do is keep saying the sheet's getting higher and higher. It's going to die eventually. But that's one more little piece. Those 2 stories. Bram writes a story on seeing, and one more thing. I found in Bram's a list of books in his personal library. John Edgar Browning, a professor, had kept a list of all these and found that Bram Stoker had a book, this guy McCrae, read it and did a book review of this book of Second Sight in the Highlands of Scotland. And the review was the only book that anyone's been able to find. And trust me, if anyone's going to find it, it's going to be John Edgar Browning. And it was published in a New Zealand newspaper. And it was published very favorably about this book about Second Sight in the Highlands of Scotland. It wasn't sort of making fun and poo-pooing this kind of strange idea of second sight. It was saying, that, in some cases it can be true, some cases it can be hoax. Very recently, I was contacted by the Rosenbach Museum, who is trying to raise money because they have the opportunity to buy one manuscript, one chapter of one of the last books Bram wrote called Famous Impostors. And it was a whole chapter on mesmerism, which is mind control, the Lucy, the mean Count Dracula thing. Is it true or is it fake? And again, Bram writes all about that. So all of those little pieces of circumstantial evidence, Rick, connected together, and that opening statement that I just read to you, yet there are some things which other people can see that other people cannot, makes me believe that Bram maybe was a believer in second sight, but he certainly was aware of it and was interested in it and acknowledged that it existed. And I think that makes Bram that much more interesting, well-rounded, open-minded person. To go far beyond the simple question of sexuality, it's much more open-minded about life in general, about mental things, physical beings and so on. Very interesting, I think, part of his life. And again, Jason and John and I have, worked that into the script, into the story, so that it shows Bram as this really kind of a deep thinker. And I'll sort of finish this segment with another quote from the novel. There are mysteries in life which men can only guess at, which age by age they may solve only in part. We may not know the answers. And in time, with more scientific exploration, more mental exploration, more experiences, we may understand things. But right now, we may not. And so what? They are what they are. Let's go with it.
Absolutely. And I can certainly see Bram exploring those aspects too, of, sort of looking at people the way that maybe most others would not. Some, certainly with Dracula's relationship that he had with Mina, he, and with Lucy, really, that he absolutely sees them in a very different light once he started to feast on them, very much more so than anybody else in the light has. And I think with the second sight, I can certainly see that, because once he's again feasted on anybody, even a few times, such as say with Jonathan Harker, all of a sudden now he can feel it when Jonathan's closer. He can see things from Jonathan's perspective, which is how it's almost like his own built-in GPS based on other people's location.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but you're right. It's a modern analogy for it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought that was super, super neat. Dacre, I could talk to you all right about this stuff. How are we fixed for time? How are you doing over there?
Well, let's start to wind this down, and let's kind of wind this down with this issue. And I'll tell you what I think of, but I'd like to know what you think, because I do value your opinion. You're well-read Dracula file. So, this in real life, Bram dies in a, his boss dies in 1904. He's got a couple, 6 or 7 more years to live. He's on a downward slide. He doesn't have a pension. He doesn't have any inheritance from Irving. He's kind of scraping things together. He writes. He has a stroke. He writes Lair of the White Worm. He likes Famous Impostors. He can't travel as much as he does. He convinces Florence to bring him to Cruden Bay, Scotland one more time in 1911, and then he dies in 1912. And it's sort of sad because, to me, a guy that has made such a huge impression on the world with one book, but also he made a big impression in Ireland with a book called The Duties of Clerks of Petty Sessions in the Legal System, which was used until 1960. So, he really was quite a remarkable person, but he sort of faded away without really knowing what his work means to this day and how it changed the world. So my question to you, even though Jason and John and I have very good idea how we think we're planning to end this story, and it's all in the works, and it left up to Jason to edit properly. But I do like asking this of my hosts of the podcast host. How do you think, knowing Bram Stoker as you do and everything I've been talking about for the last hour, what do you think would be a satisfying way, not necessarily, happy or sad, a satisfying way to end a documentary on Bram Stoker's life and his research and his writing Dracula? What 2 cents worth would you want to put in?
Well, I appreciate you asking me that. That's It's a big question. I can see that being a major challenge, and I can appreciate why you would ask myself and others about that, because there's so many different directions you can go in.
Yeah.
I mean, if you ask me every day of the week, I might have a different answer.
Different question, different answer. Yeah.
Right to this moment, as you and I are talking, right
what
now,
comes to mind? Yeah.
the first thing that comes to mind, I think, is you have to go with what's most everlasting, certainly to, no pun intended, but certainly to keep in the same vein as Dracula, to keep it on an everlasting note. And I think the most everlasting thing about Dracula is its influence. There's a reason that it's the most, most filmed dark cultural creature in cinematic history. It's absolutely a creature that endures, and it's so interesting too, because to this day we still don't have a perfect depiction of the novel Dracula. However, everybody keeps trying, so it's very much open to interpretation. And I think would it be interesting, and I wanted to ask you a question about this, but if we need to do a part 2, let me know, because of course you and I, we don't have to go to ground at nighttime, but at some point we do need some sleep. So I think it'd be really cool is to tie in with perhaps his wife, with Bram's wife, Florence, and how she really did everything she could to keep, Bram's influence alive by publishing Dracula's Guest, and what she did to go to bat posthumously for Bram regarding the Nosferatu movie, and the fascination that, in a sense, it almost seems like with everything that you know about, or at least certainly that I know about Bram Stoker through you, is that it's no surprise that he had the capacity to write such an incredible novel like Dracula. However, everything else that he's produced and that he's worked on, focused on, in a sense, it almost seems like Dracula is sort of the impossible. And it's almost like the orphan child from everything else that he's ever done. And what I find fascinating is that you could certainly tie in a lot of, I think, certainly cinematically, the influence of Dracula from Nosferatu that never should have been made in the first place. They had no rights to do that. And of course, Florence went to bat. The movie company got shut down. However, somehow it shouldn't have happened, but it got leaked anyways. And here we are waiting for Robert Eggers' version of Nosferatu to come from Universal in a few months. I didn't get paid to say that, but
I'm excited too. I am. I want to see a good one. Yeah. I think, everything you brought up about Bram may die, but his spirit lives on in this story that keeps getting remade and remade, not always, in the best way as far as we're concerned, but it's art. And art is interpretive, isn't it, Rick? Just like some people like certain books and some people don't. Some people like movies and stage plays. So to me, this is something that Jason and John and I had talked about, is incorporating this idea that Bram may have been gone, and is that spiritualism that he understood and incorporated in the story? Is the second sight, is that still in his possession? Is he somewhere still enjoying and recognizing this? Is he doing it through Florence and her efforts? He left the stage reading and the dramatic rights to his wife, and she did utilize them and end up making good money to end her life with. And the son went on, did give information to the first biographer, Harry Ludlam, and so on. To this day, there's 2 great-grandsons, my cousins, and they've got children, and one of them is on stage as a dancer in a Royal Ballet. So there is that continuum. It's sort of in the family, and then you've got, of course, me, who's keeping the legacy alive, and I'm thrilled to death that my son, who's doing his PhD in English literature, has come with me on some of my trips. He came with me up the volcano when we had the plaque up there with the leaders of the Kalamani National Park. So in a way, that legacy, what we're doing to keep the legacy alive and keep his memory alive, is, it's story worthy. And I think that's something that we will show in a way. But I don't want to give spoilers away. I don't want to tell people that we don't know what we're doing, but it is interesting to hear, what you guys think about and, what you'd like to see. And I think what I'll pledge to you now is let's have a second part of this. I'd love to, introduce you to Jason and John, and you could chat with them. And I could always come on at the end of that show and answer other questions, because it's great with someone knowledgeable like you to have some really good in-depth questions, Rick. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much. And a lot of my questions come just from all the added insight that I've certainly got from you as well. So you really opened me up to a much bigger world of Dracula and Bram Stoker. And it's kind of neat because I think certainly, I believe there's been a lot of iconic influencers as well, that, they always say that everybody dies, two deaths. That's the first one when you leave the mortal world. And of course, the second one, the last person that ever knew.
Stop talking about you. Yeah,
exactly. So I think, it's like, coincidentally enough, Bela Lugosi used to say, the only thing worse than being talked about is not being talked about.
Right. Yeah.
So certainly, of course, keep talking about Bram Stoker for a very long time, at least another 128 years and beyond. It's not slowing down.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. Well, Rick, that's great. And one of these days, you got to drag your family along and come with me on one of my trips to Transylvania, because it might be time to bring some of your guys, as we say, to the motherland. Come and check it out. But
absolutely. I mean, between Transylvania, I live, vicariously through a lot of the pictures that I've done or that I've seen that you post with, Tour Transylvania. Do I have that right? Is it Tour Transylvania? I think I screwed that up.
Experience Transylvania is the company. We're actually, just today we finalized, I'll give you a little first-hand right here, that we're actually planning a Halloween party at Bran Castle. We've rented the castle on the 28th of October. We couldn't get it on Halloween Day. It was already rented, and they wouldn't tell us who. But I'll just tell you this. Last year, it was quite a heavy hitter, Elon Musk, that rented Bran Castle on Halloween. So we got it on the 28th, so we're planning to put a tour together to bring people, see some of the other cool sites of Transylvania. But also, in the meantime, one more plug, and I'll send you the actual details. The Indiegogo campaign for Father of Dracula starts April 1st. So for all you listeners, if you want to support the program, this project that we're doing, there are some pretty cool rewards. Please go to Indiegogo April 1st and look for Father of Dracula, and you'll make everything you just heard tonight a reality, so that we can get this thing edited and out into the world. Not exactly sure where yet it will go. Hopefully it gets made so nicely it gets picked up by a streaming network or different film festivals. So who knows? But appreciate everyone's support. And Rick, as always, appreciate research and your good listening skills, as well as your good questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dacre. And it's always an honor and a pleasure. And for everybody listening, I'm going to put a link down below as well to the GoFundMe campaign. This is one of those projects that I just love being a part of as well, because it's a really cool way, especially under these circumstances, to get together and just do our best to just kind of stick the shovel in there and make this thing happen. So,
all right.
So look.
All right, everybody.
Thanks
so much. Good night.
Good night.
Bye.